When my wife passed away, her wealthy boss called me and said, "I found something. Come to my office right now." Then he added, "And don't tell your son or your daughter-in-law. You could be in danger." When I got there and saw who was standing at the door, I froze. It was my daughter-in-law's cousin, a loan officer at our bank, and he had the look of a man caught somewhere he had no business being. I'm 63 years old, and for 31 years I ran the parts counter at a diesel repair shop off the interstate, the kind of job where your hands never really get clean and you stop minding after the first decade. My wife worked as an executive assistant to the same man for 22 years, a commercial property developer who owned half the office buildings in our downtown corridor. She loved that job in a way most people never love their work. She used to say her boss trusted her with things he wouldn't tell his own family, and I believed her, because I'd seen it myself at company holiday parties, the way he'd lean over and ask her opinion before making any decision that mattered. I buried her 9 days before that phone call. The funeral was on a Tuesday morning, the kind of thin gray rain that doesn't so much fall as hang in the air and settle into your coat without you noticing. I stood at the front of the room in a suit I hadn't worn since our son's wedding, looking at a casket that held the only woman I had loved for 36 years, and I kept waiting for it to feel real. It didn't. Not that morning, and if I'm honest, not for a long while after. The paramedics had called it a cardiac event. Sudden, they said. These things happen, especially at 59, especially with the blood pressure history she'd had the last few years. I had no reason to question it. Grief doesn't leave much room for questions, and even if it had, I wasn't the kind of man who second-guessed doctors. About 40 people came to the service. Neighbors, a handful of her old co-workers, my brother who drove in from 3 hours away. My son sat in the front row beside his wife, and I remember noticing, in the distant way you notice things when your chest feels hollowed out, that neither of them cried. Not once. My daughter-in-law kept checking her phone under the funeral program, tilting it just enough to catch the light, and my son kept leaning over to murmur something to her, quick and low, more like two people coordinating logistics than two people grieving. At exactly 11:52 in the morning, right in the middle of the pastor's closing words, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I saw the name on the screen, my wife's boss and employer of over 2 decades, and something in my chest tightened before I even answered. I stepped out into the hallway, the organ music leaking faintly through the door behind me, and when I picked up, his voice was tight and thin in a way I had never once heard from that man. He was not someone who rattled. In the dozen or so times I'd met him over the years, he'd always been the steadiest person in any room, the sort of man who remembered the names of the janitor's kids, and never once raised his voice at a member of his own staff, not even when a merger fell through in front of half the office. "I found something," he said. "I need you to come to my office right now." "What did you find?" I asked, keeping my voice down so it wouldn't carry back through the door. "Not on the phone," he said. "Come to my office and listen to me carefully. Don't tell your son. Don't tell your daughter-in-law. Not yet. You could be in danger." I stood in that hallway for a long moment after he hung up, my heart going harder than it had all morning, harder than it had since the hospital called. I want to explain before I go any further exactly why those words landed the way they did, because none of what came after makes sense without the months that came before it. My wife and I built our life on a mechanic's wage and an assistant's salary. Nothing fancy, but steady. We paid off our house years ago, a modest place on a quiet street with a maple tree in front that turned the whole yard gold every October. We had a decent retirement account that we'd both contributed to since our 20s, and over the years we helped our son whenever he needed it, which, over the last several years, had become more often than either of us liked to admit out loud. Our son was 32. He'd been married to his wife for 6 years, and the two of them had been in and out of money trouble since he lost a sales job back in 2019. They ran a small online business, some kind of dropshipping venture that never quite took off no matter how many times he described the next version of it as the one that would finally work. Over the past year, they'd started coming around more. Sunday dinners had turned into Wednesday visits, and Wednesday visits had turned into my daughter-in-law offering, seemingly out of nowhere, to help my wife organize her medications and paperwork since mom's getting older and could use a hand staying on top of things. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. My wife hadn't either. Looking back now, that's exactly the problem with the whole thing. Nobody in that house was looking for a reason to be suspicious of family. In the weeks before she died, something had changed in my wife, and I hadn't paid close enough attention to it. She got tired more easily. She mentioned feeling foggy some mornings, said her heart felt like it skipped every now and then, and her doctor adjusted her blood pressure medication twice, trying to sort out what was going on. My daughter-in-law had started coming by on Tuesdays and Fridays with the same explanation each time to help sort mom's pills into the weekly organizer so she wouldn't lose track of a dose. I remember one Friday afternoon in September, I came home early from the shop and found my daughter-in-law alone in our kitchen with my wife's pill organizer open on the counter, and my wife asleep on the couch in the middle of the afternoon, which she never did, not once in 36 years of marriage. My daughter-in-law smiled at me and said Mom was just tired from her walk and left about 10 minutes later. I didn't think anything of it. My wife trusted her daughter-in-law's judgment, and I trusted my wife's. 3 days before she died, my wife also asked me if I remembered signing some paperwork with her at the kitchen table back in July, something about updating our power of attorney in case anything happened to either of us as we got older. I told her I didn't remember signing anything of the sort. She frowned, said our son had mentioned bringing something like that by for us to look over, and figured she must have just forgotten the details. We let it go. We had no reason not to. Not then. There's one more detail from that summer I should mention, because it didn't mean anything to me at the time, and it means everything to me now. In early July, my daughter-in-law had asked, almost in passing, whether the two of us kept a shared family tablet in the kitchen for recipes and old photos. We did. She said she loved looking through it when she visited, all those pictures of our son as a boy, and asked if it would be all right if she signed into her own email on it sometimes so she could send herself recipe links. My wife said, of course, without a second thought, the way you'd say yes to almost anything a daughter-in-law asked for. I didn't think about that tablet again until much later, when it turned out to be the single most important object in our house. On the morning my wife died, a Sunday, I was out getting gas 2 streets over. She called our son first because I wasn't answering, and by the time I got home 11 minutes later, the paramedics were already loading her into the ambulance. She was gone before we reached the hospital. Cardiac arrest, they told me. Sudden, unexpected. Nobody asked a single question beyond that, and in the fog of losing her, neither did I. Standing in that hallway outside the funeral home with her employer's voice still shaking in my ear, all of it came rushing back to me at once. The pill organizer, the paperwork I never signed, the tablet she'd asked to use, the way our son and his wife had been circling my wife for months like they were waiting on something to finally come due. I told our son I had insurance paperwork to sort out that afternoon, and that I'd meet everyone back at the house for the gathering. He barely looked up from his phone. My daughter-in-law didn't even glance my way. She was already walking toward the parking lot, heels clicking fast on the wet pavement, talking low into her phone to someone I couldn't see. I stood there for a second, watching my son's wife hurry away from her mother-in-law's own funeral, like she had somewhere far more important to be, and that cold feeling from the hallway settled deeper into my chest. I got into my truck, a gray pickup with 140,000 miles on it, and drove downtown toward the glass office tower where my wife had spent more of her waking hours than she had in our own home, with her casket still fresh in the ground behind me and no idea that the worst part of that day hadn't happened yet. The building took up the top 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building my wife used to point out with real pride every time we drove past it. I parked in the visitor garage a little after noon, still in my funeral suit, my tie loosened, my mind running through every version of what her boss could possibly need to show me. I walked through the lobby past the security desk, where a guard who recognized me from old company events waved me through, and I headed for the elevator bank. That's when I saw a car pull hard into the loading zone just outside the glass doors behind me. Fast, careless, angled halfway into a spot that wasn't a spot at all. It was my son's black sedan. I stopped walking completely. My son was supposed to be at the burial site right now, greeting the neighbors, thanking people for coming, standing where a son is supposed to stand on the day his mother goes into the ground. Instead, here he was, downtown at his mother's employer's office building, less than half an hour after telling me he'd meet me back at the house. I stepped behind a pillar near the elevators, my heart hammering against my ribs, and watched through the glass doors as my son got out of his car and half jogged toward the entrance, straightening his jacket, his face tight and pale in a way I had never once seen on him. He wasn't grieving. He looked like a man running out of time. I stayed behind that pillar for what felt like a full minute, watching my own son walk straight up to the reception desk, not the elevators, the front desk, and start talking fast and low to the young woman working there. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the shape of it, leaning forward, one hand flat on the counter, the posture of a man trying to talk his way into somewhere he isn't welcome. The receptionist shook her head. He said something else, more insistent, and she picked up the phone to check with someone upstairs. I used that moment to slip past them both toward the elevator, my funeral suit blending in just enough that he never turned around, and I rode up to the top floor with my pulse still hammering in my ears. Her boss was waiting for me right outside the elevator doors when they opened, his face pale, his tie already loosened like he'd been pacing for a while. "Thank God," he said, and before I could get a word out, he added, "Did you see him downstairs?" "That's my son," I said. "Tell me what's going on. Why is he here?" His jaw tightened. "Because I called your house phone by mistake this morning before I reached your cell, and your daughter-in-law picked up. I only told her I needed to speak with you about some paperwork your wife left behind. I didn't say what. Apparently that was enough to send your son racing down here to get to it before you did." My stomach dropped straight through the floor. Get to what before I did? He led me down the hallway toward his office, and over his shoulder, without turning around, he said the words that changed everything that came after them. "Your wife knew something was happening to her, and she made sure I would be the one to tell you, not them." In his office was exactly as I remembered it from company holiday parties years back. Dark wood, a wide window looking out over the lake in the distance, a desk too large for one man to need. He closed the door behind us, locked it, and walked to a small safe hidden behind a framed photo of the skyline. He pulled out a plain manila envelope with my wife's handwriting across the front. "For my husband only, if anything happens to me. She brought this to me 3 weeks ago," he said, sitting down across from me instead of behind his desk, which told me something about how seriously he meant to treat this conversation. "She said she didn't trust bringing it home. Said if anything happened to her, I was to give it to you and only you in person, and to warn you to be careful about who you told." My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside was a single folded letter in her handwriting, and a small flash drive taped to the back of of the page. I read the letter right there in his office, my funeral suit still damp at the shoulders from the rain outside. In it, my wife wrote that she'd noticed money missing from our joint retirement account. Small amounts at first, then larger ones, moved out over the course of about 4 months. She wrote that she'd asked our son about paperwork she didn't remember signing, and he'd brushed it off, but something in his face when she pushed had made her uneasy enough to start quietly checking our bank statements herself, using an old login from back when she'd managed our household accounts. She wrote that she'd found a power of attorney document filed with our bank, dated in July, with both our signatures on it, except she was almost certain neither of us had ever signed it. She wrote that she'd started feeling strange some mornings around the same time our daughter-in-law began helping organize her pills, and that she didn't want to believe what she was starting to suspect, but she wasn't willing to stay quiet about it either. "There's more on the drive," her boss said quietly. "Financial records, messages. I think you need to sit down for this part." He plugged the drive into his laptop and turned the screen toward me. The first folder held bank statements my wife had screenshotted herself. 4 separate transfers out of our retirement account between June and September, $61,000 in total, all authorized using that power of attorney document neither of us had signed. The money had gone into an account under our son and daughter-in-law's names. The second folder held photographs my wife had taken of pharmacy receipts, side by side with handwritten notes comparing what she'd been prescribed against what had actually been filled. I won't pretend I understood everything in those notes right away. What I understood, sitting there in that office with the rain still ticking against the window, was that my wife had spent the last weeks of her life quietly building a case on her own without telling either of us, because some instinct in her had said this was bigger than paperwork. The third folder was the one that put something cold and heavy straight into my chest. It held a screenshot of a message thread my wife had found on our shared family tablet, the same tablet our daughter-in-law had asked to use back in July. A conversation between our daughter-in-law and someone saved only under a first name, dated about 3 weeks before my wife died. My daughter-in-law had written, "She's getting suspicious about the account. We need to hurry this along before she says something to him." The reply read, "I can push it through Thursday. Nobody double-checks a family transfer once it clears my end." I sat completely still, staring at that screen, feeling something come loose in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. Her boss put a hand on my shoulder and told me my wife had come to him specifically because she was afraid that if something happened to her, whoever was responsible would try to control the story before I ever saw the truth, and she'd wanted to make absolutely sure that didn't happen. "She protected you from beyond the grave," he said. "Now we need to protect you for real." I asked him why he'd told me not to bring our son or his wife anywhere near this. He said it plainly. If my wife's suspicions were right, and the evidence in front of us said they very likely were, then whoever had done this was already comfortable moving large amounts of our money without either of us noticing, and there was a signed document sitting on file at our own bank that could hand them control over everything I owned the moment I was gone too. "We need proof strong enough for the police," he said, "not just suspicion, and we need it before they know we're looking." That evening, her boss made a call to an old friend of his, a retired detective who did private investigative work now, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said actually mattered. He came by the office within the hour and looked through the drive twice without saying much, and then he said the thing none of us wanted to hear out loud. "This is enough to open an investigation," he told us. "It's not enough yet to guarantee a conviction. We need the bank's internal records pulled properly, and we need to know who authorized that power of attorney to clear without a signature match." It took less than a day to get an answer, and for one night I thought it was the whole answer. The detective had a contact inside the bank's compliance department, someone who owed him a favor from years back, and by the following afternoon, he'd learned that the power of attorney had been fast-tracked through underwriting by a loan officer at our branch, a man in his late 20s who, it turned out, was my daughter-in-law's first cousin. He'd waived the standard signature verification step and logged the whole thing as routine, the kind of shortcut that happens more than banks like to admit when family is involved on both sides of a desk. The detective brought him in for an informal conversation that same evening, off the record, just to see what he'd say before anything became official. I sat in an adjoining room and listened through the door, my funeral suit finally traded for jeans and an old flannel shirt, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. The cousin cracked almost immediately. He said my daughter-in-law had come to him back in the spring, upset, saying she and my son were drowning, that the business was going under, that they were going to lose everything including custody time with their own daughter if things didn't turn around fast. She'd asked if there was any way to move some money quietly using power of attorney paperwork, just enough to get through a rough patch, and she'd promised it would all be paid back before anyone noticed. He said he genuinely believed her. He said he thought he was helping family through a hard year, not helping anyone steal from an elderly couple, and that he had no idea the transfers had gone as high as they had, no idea my wife had ever grown suspicious, no idea any of it had anything to do with her death. "I thought it was a loan," he said, his voice cracking on the recording. "She told me it was a loan. I swear to God I didn't know anything about pills or medication or any of that. I only know about the money." For a few hours that night, sitting in that back room with my funeral suit hanging over a chair and my chest finally starting to unclench for the first time in 9 days, I let myself believe that was the whole shape of it. Money trouble. A desperate daughter daughter-in-law, a compliant cousin, a foolish shortcut that spiraled further than anyone intended. Terrible. Yes. Criminal. Absolutely. But almost understandable in the way that human weakness sometimes is, and nowhere near as dark as the version of this story I'd been quietly bracing myself for since that phone call in the hallway. Her boss looked almost relieved when I said as much out loud. Maybe that's it, he said. Maybe it really was just the money. The detective didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said the thing that kept me up that entire night, staring at the ceiling in a house that suddenly felt too quiet. The pharmacy notes your wife left behind don't fit a story about a scared cousin moving cash, he said. Somebody had access to her medication that this young man never had. Somebody in her actual house on actual days when actual doses were changed. This is real, and it's serious, and we should be grateful to have it. But I don't think it's the whole thing. I think it's the part they were willing to let us find. I didn't want to hear that. I wanted the version where it was just money, where grief and greed had pushed two people into a shortcut that got out of hand, where my daughter-in-law was foolish and desperate rather than something colder than that. But I had read my wife's handwriting on those pharmacy notes myself. She hadn't been a woman who panicked over nothing. She'd been the most level-headed person I ever knew, and she had been frightened enough in her final weeks to build a case in secret and hide it with a man she trusted more than her own family. That night, I understood that the cousin's confession, true as it likely was, had only opened a door onto a larger room I hadn't seen the back of yet. I didn't sleep that night, and somewhere around 4 in the morning I stopped trying. I sat at the kitchen table where my wife and I had eaten breakfast together for 3 decades, looking at the chair where she used to sit with her coffee and the crossword, and I made a decision that I know now was the right one, even though it was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked me to do. I called her boss back before the sun was even up, and I told him I wanted to see this through properly, whatever that meant, however long it took. He and the detective met me at the office again later that morning, and we laid it all out together. The cousin's statement, off the record as it was, gave us a starting thread, but the detective was right that it didn't explain everything my wife had documented. We needed the pharmacy records pulled through official channels rather than a favor. We needed a forensic handwriting analysis on that power of attorney signature. And if I was willing, the detective said a camera in my own house for a short while would likely give us everything else, because people who believe they've gotten away with something eventually stop being careful. They talk when they think nobody's listening. I sat there in that office, my wife 9 days in the ground, being asked to walk back into my own home and pretend everything was normal while my son and his wife believed they'd already won. Nothing in 63 years of living had asked more of me than that did, and I said yes without hesitating, because my wife had trusted me with the truth, and I wasn't about to waste what she'd risked to hand it to me. The detective installed 2 small cameras in our house 2 nights later, while my son and his wife believed I was staying at my brother's place 3 hours away to grieve in peace. One was tucked into a smoke detector above the kitchen table. The other sat inside an old mantel clock in the living room that had belonged to my wife's mother, a clock that hadn't kept accurate time in years and that nobody would think twice about. I moved back home the following Monday and told everyone I simply needed to be around my wife's things for a while, that the quiet of my brother's guest room had started to feel worse than being surrounded by her handwriting on old grocery lists and her sweaters still hanging in the closet. Nobody questioned it. Grief gives you a strange kind of cover. People assume the worst version of your behavior is just sorrow, and they don't look any closer than that. I want to be honest about what those days felt like, because I don't think anyone who hasn't lived through something like it can really understand it from the outside. I sat across the dinner table from my own son 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. I passed him the salt. I asked about his daughter's school project. I listened to my daughter-in-law talk about how she wanted to help me get through probate paperwork faster, how she'd already looked into a few real estate agents in case I ever wanted to think about simplifying things and selling the house down the line. No pressure, just options, just trying to make things easier on me. Every single night, I went upstairs to the bedroom my wife and I had shared for over 3 decades, and I sat on the edge of the bed we'd bought together 30 years ago, and I let myself feel exactly as much of it as I needed to feel before closing the door on it until morning. Then I got up the next day and did it again, because the detective had told me, plainly, that the moment they felt fully safe was the moment they would stop being careful, and I needed them to feel safe more than I needed to feel anything myself. The forensic handwriting analyst confirmed within the first week that the signatures on the power of attorney document were not a match for either my wife's hand or my own. Someone had traced or closely imitated both of our signatures well enough to pass a bank's initial glance, though not well enough to survive real scrutiny. The pharmacy's corporate office, once the detective's contact filed the request through proper legal channels, rather than a personal favor, confirmed an early refill pattern on one of my wife's prescriptions that didn't match her documented dosage schedule at all. None of it, on its own, was the whole truth yet. But piece by piece, over the course of that first week home, the outline of something much larger than a cousin's bad judgment at a bank branch started to take shape in front of me, and I understood that whatever the false comfort of that first night's confession had given me, it hadn't been the truth. It had only ever been the part of the truth someone was willing to let us find first. 11 days is a strange amount of time to live inside a lie, long enough to start feeling like the lie is simply how your life works now, short enough that every single day still felt like like walking across ice I wasn't sure would hold. There was one evening, about a week in, that came closer than any other to breaking the whole plan wide open before we were ready. My daughter-in-law had come by on a Thursday to drop off a casserole, the kind of gesture that would have looked, to anyone watching from outside, exactly like a caring daughter-in-law checking in on a grieving father-in-law. She stayed longer than usual that night, and at some point, while I was in the other room getting a serving dish down from the cabinet, I heard her on the phone in the kitchen, her voice pitched low, but not quite low enough. "He's still just moping around the house," she said. "I don't think he suspects anything. He barely looks at his own mail anymore. He just hands me the whole stack." A pause, then quieter. "No, I haven't heard anything back from the bank about the timeline. I need you to check on that. If this drags out much longer, we're going to have a problem with the next quarter's payment." I stood frozen in the pantry doorway with a serving dish in my hands, my pulse roaring in my ears, close enough to hear every word and far enough that she had no idea I was there. I wanted, more than I have ever wanted anything, to walk into that kitchen and ask her flat out who she was talking to and what payment she meant. The detective had told me more than once that one wrong move born out of grief or anger could undo weeks of careful groundwork in a single sentence. So I stood there in that pantry with my jaw clenched so tight it ached for an hour afterward, and I waited until I heard her end the call, and then I walked into the kitchen a full minute later like nothing at all had happened and asked her if she wanted a glass of water. She smiled at me, the same warm, practiced smile she'd been giving me since the funeral, and said that would be lovely, and thanked me again for letting her help me through such a difficult time. That night, after she left, I sat in my truck in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could bring myself to go back inside, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, because I finally understood, in a way I hadn't quite let myself understand before that phone call in my own kitchen, that this wasn't a woman who had made one desperate mistake in a difficult year. This was a woman managing an ongoing operation, checking in on a timeline, worried about a next payment, speaking about my grief and my mail and my trust the way you'd speak about inventory. I called the detective that same night and told him what I'd overheard. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've thought about often since. That's not the voice of someone who got in over her head and panicked. That's the voice of someone running a system. Systems have more than one person keeping them running. We're not done finding who else is involved. 2 days after that, the pharmacy's corporate compliance office sent over the refill history the detective had requested weeks earlier. It showed exactly what my wife's own handwritten notes had already suggested, an early refill pattern inconsistent with her prescribed schedule, filled under her insurance at a location 20 minutes farther from our house than her usual pharmacy, a location, it turned out, that shared a parking lot with the small satellite bank branch where my daughter-in-law's cousin worked. I don't think I fully understood, until I saw those two addresses printed side by side on an official letterhead, just how carefully constructed the last several months of my wife's life had actually been around us, hidden in plain sight inside errands and casseroles and a granddaughter's school pickups, so ordinary that neither of us had ever thought to ask a single extra question. The detective told me, gently but plainly, that we were close now. Close enough that we needed to stop reacting to pieces and start building toward the moment we'd bring everything into the light at once, on our own terms, rather than theirs. The 12th night is the one I still replay most often, even now, months later. My son and his wife had come by for dinner, something we'd settled into as a near-weekly rhythm by then, and after the dishes were cleared, I told them I was tired and wanted to turn in early. That had become normal, too. Nobody thought twice about a grieving man wanting an early night. I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door most of the way, and sat on the edge of the bed listening to the muffled sound of their voices through the floor, my phone in my hand, watching the live feed from the kitchen camera the detective had shown me how to access. For the first several minutes, it was nothing. The clink of a wine glass. My daughter-in-law asking my son if he'd remembered to pick up their daughter's shoes from the shop. Ordinary, domestic, the kind of conversation that made me almost believe for one soft and dangerous second that I'd imagined the whole shape of what I thought I knew. Then my daughter-in-law's voice changed, lower, different. "The account's fully transferred," she said. "Once he signs off on selling the house, we're done. We don't even need the power of attorney anymore." My son's voice, after a pause, "Just don't get sloppy like you did before. That refill pattern almost got flagged once already. Nobody audits a retirement transfer for family," she said, and I could hear, even through a phone screen and a floor and a closed door, that she was smiling when she said it. "Nobody ever does." I sat completely still on that bed for a long time after they left that night, longer than I want to admit, the phone screen gone dark in my hand, my chest doing something between breaking and going numb. I thought about every Sunday dinner my wife had cooked for that boy for 30 years. I thought about her handwriting on those pharmacy notes, careful and worried and trying so hard not to believe what she was seeing. I thought about the fact that she had died 9 days before I finally heard with my own ears exactly how little either of them had ever grieved her at all. I called the detective the next morning before I'd even had coffee, and I played him the recording over speakerphone with my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone twice. He was quiet when it finished. Then he said, "That's what we needed." That, combined with the loan file, the handwriting analysis, and the refill records, that's enough to bring in the people who matter. We do this properly now. We do this on our terms. I asked him what came next, my voice sounding strange strange and distant to my own ears. We let them believe, for just a little while longer, that they've already won, he said, and then we take that away from them in a room where it can't be denied. What followed over the next several days was less dramatic than the recording itself, but in its own way, it mattered just as much, because it was the part where everything my wife had suspected in secret finally became something the world outside our family had to take seriously too. The detective walked the recording, the loan file, the pharmacy records, and the handwriting analysis to a contact he trusted at the district attorney's office, a woman who had prosecuted elder financial exploitation cases for the better part of a decade, and who did not need much convincing once she'd reviewed what we had. She told the detective, and the detective told me, that cases like this usually take months to build because families protect each other reflexively, out of habit or shame or disbelief, and that having a victim's own documentation gathered before her death was rarer and more valuable than almost anything else a prosecutor could ask for. The bank's internal compliance office, once formally notified through the district attorney rather than through a personal favor, moved with a speed that almost startled me. Within 2 days, my daughter-in-law's cousin had been placed on administrative leave pending a full audit of every file he'd processed over the past year. He was brought in that same week, this time in an official capacity with his own attorney present, to explain the specific transaction that had first caught my wife's attention. It was in the lobby of that very building, walking in for that exact meeting, that I finally understood who the man standing at the door had been the day I'd first arrived downtown in my funeral suit and why he had looked so thoroughly caught. The forensic handwriting analyst's report came back fully documented and notarized that same week, stating in plain, careful language that the signatures on the power of attorney belonged to neither my wife nor myself, and that the forgeries, while competent enough to pass a first glance, showed clear and consistent inconsistencies in pressure and letter formation when compared against decades of our verified signatures on file with our own bank. The pharmacy's corporate legal department, once subpoenaed rather than simply asked, released the complete and unredacted refill history for that entire year, cross-referenced against the prescribing physician's actual orders. The discrepancy was there in black and white, dates and quantities that did not match what any doctor had authorized, filled at a location that, as we already knew, sat in the same small parking lot as the bank branch down the road. None of these institutions moved because they cared about my family specifically. They moved because the evidence, once it was properly documented and formally submitted rather than pieced together after hours by a grieving widower and a retired detective working favors, met the plain legal threshold each of them was built to respond to. There is something I find strange to sit with even now, about how much of getting justice for my wife came down to the right paperwork, landing on the right desk in the right order. She would have understood that better than anyone. She spent 22 years of her working life making sure the right paperwork landed on the right desk for a man who trusted her completely. In the end, it was that same instinct, applied to protecting her own family, that gave us everything we needed. By the end of that week, the detective told me we had what he called an airtight case. 4 separate strands of independent, institutionally verified evidence that corroborated each other, and corroborated my wife's own secret documentation down to the smallest detail. All that remained was deciding exactly when and how to bring it into the light. We decided to do it at the reading of my wife's will. Our family lawyer had handled our estate paperwork for years, and she'd already scheduled the reading for the following Thursday morning at her office before any of this had come to light, which made it the perfect occasion. My son and his wife had no idea the detective would be sitting quietly in the small conference room next door, or that 2 officers from the district attorney's office would be waiting in an unmarked car in the parking lot, watching for the detective's signal through a phone left open on the table. I spent that final week acting exactly the way I had for the 11 days before it. Tired, quiet, cooperative, letting my daughter-in-law believe her plan was proceeding exactly as intended. She even hugged me the morning of the meeting and told me she was proud of how strong I'd been through everything. I remember standing there, letting her arms wrap around me, thinking about her voice in that phone call I'd overheard from the pantry, and feeling absolutely nothing but cold, steady patience. We all sat down in the lawyer's office a little after 10 in the morning. My son, in a gray suit, his wife in black, both of them composed, almost relaxed, clearly expecting a simple formality before they collected what they believed was already theirs. Our lawyer went through the standard opening of the will reading, and then, right on cue, she looked at me and asked if there was anything I wanted to add before continuing. Actually, yes, I said, and I watched my son's face shift just slightly, the first flicker of unease crossing it. Before we go any further, I think it's time everyone in this room saw exactly what my wife left behind. I nodded toward the door, and my wife's boss walked in carrying his laptop, followed by the detective, whose face my son clearly recognized from somewhere. An old traffic stop, maybe just instinct, because the color drained out of him immediately. My daughter-in-law's voice came out sharp. "What is this? What's going on?" I looked at her steadily and said, "My wife is exactly what's going on." Her boss set the laptop on the conference table and played the kitchen recording without a word of introduction. My daughter-in-law's own voice filled that small office clear as day, talking about the account being fully transferred, about not needing the power of attorney anymore, and then my son's voice answering back, warning her not to get get sloppy again, about a refill pattern that had almost gotten flagged once already. The room went dead silent except for that recording playing out loud, every word of it landing like a hammer against stone. My daughter-in-law's face went white, then red, and she stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. That's not what it sounds like. That's taken completely out of context. Sit down, the detective said calmly, showing his credentials for the first time since walking in. There are officers waiting outside this office right now, and everything you say from this point forward can be used against you. Financial exploitation of an elder, forgery, and an active investigation already underway with the district attorney's office into your access to your mother-in-law's prescribed medication in the weeks before her death. My son hadn't said a single word yet. He just sat there staring at the table, and I watched something break in my own child's face. Not innocence, because that had been gone for longer than I wanted to admit to myself. The specific look of a man who finally understood there was nowhere left to run. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking, "I never wanted any of this to go as far as it did. I swear to you. It was just supposed to be about the paperwork, about buying us some time." I felt her former boss's hand land on my shoulder, steady, grounding, because for one long second, the room tilted around me and all I could see was my wife in that hospital bed I never reached in time to say goodbye to properly. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Your mother sat at that kitchen table every Sunday for 30 years, making sure you had a full plate before she ever filled her own," I said quietly. "And the whole time, you were counting down how long it would take to get the house." The officers came in less than 2 minutes later. My daughter-in-law cried the entire way out to the car. My son didn't say another word. It's been almost 8 months now since that morning in the lawyer's office. My son pled guilty to forgery and financial exploitation of an elder and is currently serving a sentence at a correctional facility upstate. My daughter-in-law's case went further. Once the district attorney's office completed its full investigation into the medication discrepancies alongside the financial charges, and she's now facing additional counts tied directly to my wife's death. Her cousin lost his position at the bank permanently and is facing his own separate charges for falsifying financial records, though his attorney has argued, and may well succeed in arguing, that he believed at the time he was only helping family through a hard year. I got the retirement money back, every dollar of it, through the court. The money was never really the point, though I understand now why my wife never once mentioned the amount in her letter to me. She wasn't trying to save money. She was trying to save me. Her boss and I have become genuinely close friends since all of this, something neither of us expected the day I walked off an elevator in a rumpled funeral suit and found him pale and pacing outside his own office. He tells me now that my wife used to talk about me more than I ever knew during all those years at work, always certain, always proud, always saying I'd do right by her if it ever came down to that. I think about that a great deal these days. I still live in the house on Maple Heights, in the same kitchen where a camera once sat hidden inside a smoke detector above the table, in the same bedroom where I used to sit on the edge of the bed each night and feel exactly as much as I could stand before setting it aside until morning. Some mornings the quiet still hurts. Most mornings now it just feels honest. I set up a small memorial fund in my wife's name through the cardiac care unit at the hospital that treated her, meant for families who can't afford the kind of follow-up monitoring that might have caught what was happening to her sooner, back when there was still time for it to matter. It isn't large yet. It's growing steadily, a little more every month, and every dollar in it carries her name forward doing something good in the world, which is exactly the kind of thing she would have wanted done with it. I think about that hallway outside the funeral home more often than I probably should, her boss's voice shaking on the other end of the line, telling me to come see something before it was too late for it to matter. My wife protected me one last time from somewhere I couldn't follow her to, and some nights, sitting alone at that same kitchen table where I used to hear her humming while she made coffee, I still reach for the chair across from mine before I remember all over again that it's empty now, and that it's going to stay that way.